Okay, we are on Chapter 12.
Page 137.
Eric Liddell. This chapter is called More Coal.
Burrito.
Slowly, the Japanese began to get the upper hand on the Great Plain. They showed some respect for the work of the London Missionary Society Hospital, but not a lot. One night, not too long after Eric had rescued the man with the slashed neck, a huge commotion broke out in the men's ward of the hospital. Eric awoke with a start. Hearing the noise, he leapt out of bed, pulled his clothes on over his pajamas, and rushed off to see what was happening. When he reached the ward, he was met by a grim-faced Dr. McCall. "What's happened?" he asked. "As far as we can make out, the communists jumped the hospital compound wall and kidnapped one of the Japanese soldiers we were treating. The one with the bullet wound in his leg," said Dr. McCall. Eric gave a low whistle. "How long ago?" "No more than 5 minutes. It gave the night nurse a terrible scare. They dragged him off like a sack of rice. I wish they wouldn't use the hospital as a combat zone." Dr. McCall sighed and shook his head as he spoke. "I wonder what the Japanese will do when they find out one of their men has been captured," Eric mused. As if to answer his question, a hail of machine gun bullets hit the hospital wall, and Eric could hear the whistle of mortar bombs. Eric and Dr. McCall looked at each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. "It's got to be the Japanese," Eric blurted. "They must think the communists are still inside the hospital compound somewhere." Dr. McCall turned quickly towards the door. "I'll try to reach them and convince the commander they've made a mistake. You see what you can do for the patients. Move the ones by the windows if you can." He yelled back over his shoulder at Eric. Much to Eric's relief, 10 minutes later, the attack ended as abruptly am I tired? Abruptly as it had begun. Anyways. Several minutes after that, Dr. McCall strolled back into the hospital with a smile on his face. "Everything's all right here, I take it?" he said, looking at Eric. Eric nodded and then replied, "Yes, but some of the patients are pretty shaken up. How did it go with the commander?" "Quite extraordinary, really. Let's go outside and check up on the damage, and I'll tell you all about it," he said. When he had shut the door behind them, Dr. McCall told the story. He had been taken to a small hut just outside the compound where the Japanese colonel was lying on the couch. "At first, he would not even turn around to look at me," said the doctor. "So I started talking to him in Chinese, hoping to get his attention. Then that didn't work, so I started in on Pidgin English. He let me go on for a minute or two, and then all at once he jumped off the couch and yelled something in Japanese. The 2 guards who had brought me to see him hurried out of the room and shut the door behind them. Then the colonel turned to me and said with an American accent, 'Forget it, buddy.' 'So you speak English?' I asked. He nodded and hung his head. He told me his parents were from Japan, but he had been born and raised in California. Although he was born in the United States, he decided to help the Japanese win the war in China. He was most unhappy, though. He said, 'Now all I ever do is kill. I don't know how to get out of this mess.'" Eric shook his head wearily. There are so many people trapped in this war on both sides. I wish it were over." But the war was far from over. In fact, it was growing by the day as more cities fell to the Japanese. Eric got regular letters from Flo, and the news was not good. Despite the local government's best efforts, Titsin was now firmly under Japanese occupation. Newspapers were told what they could and couldn't not print, and most means of transportation, not much has changed. You still can't print what you want to print. Anyways, Most means of transportation, including the railways and even the post office, were controlled by the Japanese. To pay for their war, the Japanese were importing into China huge quantities of heroin, a highly addictive and dangerous drug. In Tianjin and other Chinese cities, many people had become addicted. That's what they're trying to do in America, too. Bringing drugs over the border. So God help us. Despite what was happening in Tianjin, Eric continually reminded himself that Flo and the girls were much safer there than out in Xichang with him. Oh boy, excuse me. In January 1939, the hospital was in crisis. It was the middle of a particularly harsh winter, and the hospital was heated by coal-fired hot water heaters. The Japanese in the surrounding countryside decided to steal the hospital's supply of coal to keep themselves warm. On the Great Plain of North China in winter, a hospital can't function for long without heat. Something had to be done about the situation at once. Eric volunteered to return to the London Missionary Society headquarters in Tianjin to get the money needed to buy more coal to replace what the Japanese had stolen. He knew it would be a dangerous journey that would take him through territory controlled by different armies. In one particular place, he would have to travel over a tract of land that was held by communists. In addition, the railway lines that ran along both sides of the land were controlled by the Japanese. Eric set out early on Monday morning and got into difficulty almost immediately. He was confronted by a group of Japanese soldiers who demanded to know what a foreigner was doing roaming the Chinese countryside in the dead of winter. Eric explained who he was, and the soldiers all laughed at him. They told him to take off his shoes and jacket so they could search them. They found nothing that interested them and finally let him go. But the same situation soon repeated itself, this time with communist soldiers. It happened several more times with different patrols before Eric reached Tianjin. Eric began to wonder how he would ever make it back to Xiaocheng with a large sum of money. The first men to search him would surely steal it.
Is this why the chapter is called More Coal?
Mm-hmm. After several days of train rides, cart rides, and boat rides, Eric finally made it the 400 miles to Tianjin. That's like from Sioux Falls to Rapid City, but further. Once safely there, he hurried to visit Flo and the children. It was a wonderful reunion. They had not seen each other for 8 months. 4-year-old Patricia proudly showed her daddy how she could write her name, and 3-year-old Heather sang every song she had learned at Sunday school. Eric loved being home again with his family. The next day, Eric went to the London Missionary Society headquarters to report on the situation at the hospital and the need for money to buy more coal. The director told Eric that rather than take the money back to Xiaocheng to buy coal, he should take a ferry boat south to Chichao to buy coal there. Then he should hire a barge and have it towed through the rivers and canals back to Xiaocheng. That way he would be able to get much more coal for the money. Eric spent the next 2 days with his family. At first, Heather was shy, but soon she was willing. She was calling him daddy and cuddling up on his knee. At the end of the 2 days, it broke Eric's heart to leave his family again, but he had no choice. The hospital had to have coal to provide heat, for many patients could die. Eric's journey back started well. The ferry boat trip was uneventful, and Eric was able to buy a good amount of coal in Tichao. He still have some money left over. He hired a barge onto which the coal was loaded, and then he hopped aboard for the journey inland. The land alongside the river was occupied by various armies, each of which demanded a toll from the river traffic that passed by their location. The remainder of Eric's money started to disappear as fast as it was handed over to pay tolls. Then, during the first night on the barge, something else disappeared. Half the coal. Bandits had made off with it while Eric slept. Eric was discouraged, but not ready to give up. The following day, though, bandits attacked again. This time, Eric held at gunpoint while the bandits took the rest of the coal from the barge. Before they left, the bandits also took the last of Eric's money. Eric had no choice. He left the barge and headed back to Tianjin to try again. This time, Eric decided not to bring any coal back with him. He would better to buy less coal for the money when he got back to the hospital than to arrive with a barge and no coal. Eric was also determined not to be robbed again, so he hid the money in a hollowed-out loaf of French bread that poked innocently from the top of his knapsack. The trip turned out to be uneventful until about 70 miles from Xiaocheng. The train Eric was riding on suddenly shuddered to a halt. Eric and the other passengers climbed out to see what the problem was, hoping it was nothing serious, as it was snowing outside, and they did not want to be stopped for long. Eric couldn't see very far in front of him because of the snow, but news filtered back to where he stood, stomping his feet to keep warm. It was bad news. Some Chinese peasants had sabotaged the railroad tracks as a way to get back on at the Japanese. They had torn up a large section of the rails, and a freight train had run off the end of the tracks and lay in a crumpled heap directly in front of them. Soon the conductor confirmed that this was indeed what had happened. He then told the passengers that the train would back up to the last station they had passed and wait for the tracks to be repaired. Though no one seemed to know how long it would be, if any of the passengers wanted to continue with their journey, they would have to walk along the torn-up tracks and wait at the other end for another train, which would then back up into the direction they were headed. Eric knew he had to keep going. The need for coal at the hospital was serious by now, so he swung his knapsack with the French bread still sticking out of it into his back and headed up the tracks with a dozen other passengers. Eric pulled the collar of his woolen coat around his face and braced himself against the cutting wind. The snow whipped into his eyes, making it hard to see. Eric and the other passengers formed a line and followed the bumps of the railroad ties that were visible in the snow. They walked on and on, mile after mile. Finally, 6 miles from where they had started walking, they reached the end of the torn-up section of tracks. They soon realized, however, that they would have to walk on until they came to a station. If they waited for a train to come to the end of the tracks, it might be derailed and wrecked, just like the freight train had been. They kept walking until they would reach a station where the train would stop, and they could tell the engineer to back up. It was another 3 miles to the station. It was getting colder, and night was falling when they arrived at the station. It was not the type of station Eric had hoped for. There was no building to shelter in, just a sign and a platform. Eric and his fellow travelers slumped onto the platform. They huddled together to keep warm and constantly glanced down the railroad tracks, hoping to see a train. They had to wait through the night until around noon the following day before they finally heard the unmistakable rumble of the steam engine through the silence of the snow-draped countryside. The train stopped beside the station platform. The engineer was surprised to see a group of snow-covered people huddling together for warmth. He was not surprised, though, to hear about the torn-up railroad tracks. An army needs supplies and destroying the tracks to prevent trains from getting through to the front lines was an easy way to hurt the Japanese. Eric climbed onto the train and collapsed into a seat. He just wanted to get back to the hospital so that he could sleep. The train began to back up, and 3 hours later, Eric recognized the station at Xiaocheng. He had made it back safely, and with all the money from the station, he hired a cart to take him to the hospital compound. At the hospital, Eric reached into his knapsack and pulled out a loaf of French bread. He ripped it open, and a bundle of money fell out. After counting it, he proudly handed it over to the hospital director. It had been a difficult mission, but he had succeeded. In fact, he had done such a good job, he was asked to do it again 2 days later. Eric was sitting on a mule cart, headed back to Tientsin. This time, his assignment was to collect desperately needed medical supplies for the hospital. Although still exhausted from the stress of the previous trip, Eric was excited. He could hardly wait to get to Tientsin. Before he set out, the hospital director had released him to take a long-awaited furlough with Flo and the girls as soon as the supplies had been safely delivered to the hospital. Eric was eager to tell Flo the good news. How wonderful it would be to spend a year away from the constant stress of war. Eric made plans in his head for the furlough as he rumbled along on the mule cart, but he had no way of knowing then that far from leaving war behind him, he and Flo and the two girls took their furlough. They would be headed into another war, a different war, a war that would nearly cost all four of them their lives. The end. Of the chapter.